Welcome everyone to this first edition of the Cambridge Intelligence Seminar for the academic year 2024 to 2025. The seminar will be meeting this term, similar to last year, through a mixture of hybrid and online-only events. Professor Christopher Andrew, the creator of the Cambridge Intelligence Seminar, unfortunately is unable to attend this evening and sends his apologies. Our speaker today is Dr. John Ranelagh. John is the author of the Cambridge Short History of Ireland and also of one of the first ever histories of the CIA. 1974 to 1979, he was with the Conservative Party's research department, where he had responsibility first for education policy and then for foreign policy. His latest book, the subject of today's talk, made front-page news in Ireland for some of the historiographical conclusions it made about the history of the Republic of Ireland. I'll now hand over to John for his discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, that introduction cost me a lot of money. Thanks, Chancellor, very much indeed. Right, so number one.
Nice dive, 300 feet. All ahead full. Another destroyer coming in fast. Big for depth charge, silent running. Big for depth charge, silent running.
That lurid beginning is to make the point, to emphasize the point, that when we're talking about the Irish Republican Brotherhood, they were a formidable, resourceful, and highly dangerous group of people. They are not to be underestimated, and their effects are to be seen to the present day, not simply in submarines, but also in terror and violence, particularly in Northern Ireland. The story of the IRB really begins with Theobald Wolfe Tone, who was one of the, if not the particular leader of a rebellion in 1798 in Ireland. I'll come to Wolfe Tone. In effect, begins our story, but he also ends it, as we will see. But Tone's particular message was one of force. He dismissed the idea of negotiations or parliamentary activity as the way to get Irish independence. It would only come from the use of force, was his message, and he lived and died by that. The leaders of the 1798 rebellion many of them were Protestant. This was not a Catholic conspiracy. And indeed, many of the leading people in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, up to and including 1922, were also Protestants. Tom Clark, perhaps the most famous particular member after Michael Collins. Tom Clark, who was the leader of the 1916 rebellion in Ireland, his father was a Protestant. So it's to think of these of Irish history in terms of religion is to make a mistake. It's a journalistic mistake. Religion is important, but it is not the only dividing line. There are others which are as important. The IRB itself was started in 1858 by a fellow called James Stephens. And by his own account, he went around Ireland for travelling 3,000 miles recruiting likely lads. and he had success. His recruiting drive consisted of establishing what he called circles, small groups of members. The head of a circle would know the other heads of circles in his locality. Women were not involved in this at all. And to maintain secrecy, his model was a loosely knit congregation of European secret societies, known generally as the Carbonari, who were in the mid-19th century fairly active in campaigning for Republican governments and various independences. But these circles were intended and were successful in maintaining the integrity. The leaders of the IRB were known to the police and to the authorities. But what they were up to was easily guessed at, namely plotting revolution and all sorts of mayhem. But the particular details of all that were successfully kept secret. So that when the 1916 Rising came about, it was a surprise to everyone, apart from the partakers thereof. There's only one instance that we know of the IRB being penetrated by the Royal Irish Constabulary, and that was not at a high level. The IRB itself consisted of perhaps no more at any one time than 2,000 members, often less than that, and they were spread throughout the country. They weren't only urban. It wasn't just an urban movement. It was also a countrywide movement, or secret organization. It was designed to expend itself in revolution, in rebellion. It was not designed to live forever. It had a purpose, and that purpose was to get rid of Britain in Ireland. And once that was done, it felt that its job and its purpose would be complete. It was intellectually substantial. It was international. There was an American sister organization called Clan na Gael, which was started in 1867 by the IRB. The IRB in the British Isles moved to create a sister organization in the United States called Clan na Gael. Clan na Gael became the principal financier and arms supplier of later on of the IRA and at all times of the IRB. One of the other interesting things that the IRB got up to was that it was responsible for the Tommy gun, the Thompson submachine gun, which was invented by an American brigadier general called Thompson, therefore the name, but he couldn't get any funding for it. And then the Clan na Gael came through with one of their members, a fellow called Tom Ryan, who was one of the 10 richest men in the United States. And he funded it, and the first Tommy guns were used by the IRA in 1921. So two, if you like, important military developments are the secret society was responsible for. I think I've made my point that we mustn't underestimate them. And then, although they're not here anymore, they continue in a form in the various IRAs today. The people themselves, the members themselves, described the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. A fellow called Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, who was one of the founders, described it as preaching the doctrine of assassination in Ireland's fight for home rule. Michael Collins, later the leader of the IRB, had a marvelous quote: "Careful application of terrorism is also an excellent form of total communication." Be under no misapprehension about this. These guys were involved with terror, they knew it and they meant it. And it was very effective. Behind this, however, lies an important amount of idealism and and how the IRB saw Irish nationalism, and the idealism. We lived in dreams always. We never enjoyed them. I dreamt of an Ireland that never existed and never could exist. I dreamt of the people of Ireland as a heroic people, a Gaelic people. They had a genuine idealism, and the other side of it was that it was a cultural nationalism. They saw their job as doing everything they could to roll back the Anglicization of Ireland, the way that English had replaced Irish in speech, how the English forms had been successfully installed. The fact that, for example, between 40 and 60% of the British military in the 19th century was composed of Irishmen. I presume the others were composed of Scotsmen. But in other words, when people talk about British colonialism in the 19th century, there was an Irish heel on a lot of necks. And this is what the IRB was trying to roll back. It wasn't so much political nationalism, which of course goes without saying. If you want independence, it's got to be political. But their real bugbear and their purpose was a cultural one. So they spent a lot of time infiltrating and trying to influence Irish cultural organisations, both in sport, the Gaelic Athletic Association, culture, the Gaelic League, everything that was involved in maintaining Irish or being interested in Irish culture. The IRB focused on and tried not necessarily to control. They were very anxious to control the military elements, but to influence and to gently try to move people along to their point of view, namely this cultural nationalism. The IRB was a constitutionally bound secret society. They had a number of constitutions, and they organized themselves in great part to deal with the Roman Catholic Church, which saw all secret societies as sinful, and the Church's opposition, simply on those grounds, was a serious impediment to IRB recruitment, and so they formed themselves as what they considered to be the government of the Irish Republic. And the head of the IRB was the president of the Irish Republic, chairman of the Supreme Council, which was their governing body, president of the Irish Republic. And so therefore they went forward and argued that since they were a government, they had as much standing, or should have as much standing in the eyes of the Church as any other government, and therefore should not be denied. And that was an important point. Their oath, the principal oath, which was in existence from 1873 to 1920, it was changed in 1920 by Collins. I'll come back to that. Read as follows: "In the presence of God, I, XYZ, in other words, I, John Ranelagh, do solemnly swear that I will do my utmost to establish the national independence of Ireland, and that I will bear true allegiance to the Supreme Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and government of the Irish Republic, and implicitly obey the Constitution of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and all my superior officers, and that I will preserve inviolable the secrets of the organization." That oath was changed in 1920 to incorporate the then existence of the IRA as the army of the IRB, and as I will come to. The Fenians in America came to be synonymous with the IRB, and from 1867 to 1871, they launched attacks on Canada, which became increasingly embarrassing for the government in Washington. which finally was able to put an end to it. But the Fenians then just became, in effect, the part of the Clan na Gael, and lent their name to the whole lot. So the IRB was known as the Fenians, as well as the people in America. And in the 1880s, in 1867, Stevens had tried to launch a rebellion which was totally aborted. The leaders were all known and arrested, and it was just a mess. Whereupon he escaped and went to France. As James Joyce in Ulysses remarks about him, the man who got away, James Stevens. Then the Americans in effect took over, and in the 1880s launched a bombing campaign in England, including getting a bomb into the House of Commons, into Westminster Hall, which I think counts, and elsewhere, and killed a number of people. Most of those involved, most of the bombers were captured and imprisoned. Some were executed. And after that, for about 30 years, the IRB really became somewhat moribund. It existed, but its energy seemed to go out. It had members. They seemed to congregate in Dublin Corporation and in the civil service. A lot of them started supporting the Irish Parliamentary Party, in particular Charles Stewart Parnell, but sort of going into politics rather than Wolfe Tone's force and the determination to use force to achieve their objectives. This was changed in the early 1900s, but particularly by a group of Northern Irish IRB men, led by Bulmer Hobson, again a Protestant, in fact a Quaker, but mindful that Richard Nixon was one too, one wonders about their purity. Anyhow, and he set about trying to revitalize and reorganize, including setting up basically a Boy Scouts operation, which later on became, if you like, the Irish Boy Scouts. But he and then a young man called Sean McDermott started raising money to proselytize and to run around organizing. And then Tom Clark, who'd been in prison in Britain because he was one of the bombers in the 1880s who'd been captured, but he was released as on a ticket of leave. In other words, he could be sent back to prison if they caught him doing anything bad again. He'd gone to America and became an American citizen. And married there, and then came back to Ireland specifically to reorganize the IRB with the support of Clan na Gael's money and its contacts. And this is what he did. And by 1916, when the IRB launched its rebellion, it was an IRB rebellion. Tom Clark and his colleagues in particular were very, very happy that they had succeeded. They didn't think that they would succeed in winning in 1916. What they felt they had succeeded in was revitalizing what they regarded as the ancestral opposition to Britain. And I think in retrospect one can say they had a success there, although the rising itself was not successful. You have this wonderful quote from Patrick Pearse, who was the military leader in 1916. They saw that hopeless rebellion would be a reinvigorating affair. As he put it, the old heart of the earth needed to be warmed with the red wine of the battlefields. Well, good luck to him. I mean, just not shortly thereafter, in the First Battle of Ypres, a British soldier was killed every 2 seconds. I mean, it was just so much bloody nonsense. It really is bloody nonsense. But anyway, one of the IRB men taking part in 1916 went on to say, I thought I was finished, you know. I thought we wouldn't get out of this. When I saw how the caper was going, we're going to cop it this time. When I found myself afterwards out of the whole thing, I thought, this is a bonus. I was living on borrowed time. So the human factor is always there. But the 1916 Rising itself perhaps involved 1,200 people throughout the country, perhaps 700 or 800 in Dublin. They were nearly all IRB, and as they came out, they said that they called themselves the IRA. This is the first stirrings of the IRA. Our army was in existence again, said Michael Collins. It was not brought into being, as is wrongfully supposed, by the example of Carson's recruiting in northeast Ulster. That's referring to the creation of the Ulster Volunteers, who were opposed to Home Rule. It needed no such example. It was already in being, the old Irish Republican Brotherhood in fuller force. Now, I'm very glad to have got that observation from Collins, because the terminology is important. From this moment onwards, we have in Irish nationalist politics, we have a tug of war going on between, if you like, constitutionalists and fundamentally parliamentarians and the men of violence. And this is kind of covered up by talking about the Irish Volunteers, which were formed in 1912 as a counterbalance, in fact, to Carson's Ulster Volunteers, and giving them the credit for what the IRA actually did. The IRA was always a separate operation, an IRB operation, hidden within the volunteers. But they were conscious of being separate and different, and when the fighting with Britain was over, that difference was revealed again. The IRB was, after 1916, was in effect personified by Michael Collins. Now, I have to assume that people know who I'm talking about. He's perhaps the most famous, along with Éamon de Valera, Irishman of the 20th century. I mean, we consider Billy Yeats to be English, I think. In political terms, it's Collins and Dev. And though the two of them were straining against each other from 1918 onwards to have control of the national movement, which was growing and growing and growing in support. 1916, the Rising itself, the IRB's Rising, did not achieve this growth of support. What did achieve it was the threat of conscription in 1917 and 1918. Towards the end of 1915, conscription was introduced in England, in Wales and Scotland, but not in Ireland. Until that moment, the voluntary enlistment in Ireland and in Britain was the same. About 25% of the eligible men volunteered for the British military in Ireland as well as in Britain. So you see this, there's a community here, and it's that community which the IRB was against. It was trying to break that connection, just as Wolfe Tone said, break the connection with England. And this was what they were up against. Interestingly, about 260,000 Irishmen were in the British military during World War I. About 200,000 of them volunteered during the war, which, if you work it out, averages out at something like 50, about 1,000 a week. Now, of course, later on it was less than that, and at the beginning it was more than that. But just to give you an average, it shows you what the IRB was up against. And these people, these volunteers, were not from the poorest areas. This is interesting. They were not from. They were not joining up because it was an easy way of getting money. They were joining up very often out of idealism. A small country, Belgium, had been occupied, without warning by the wicked Germans. And that hit a chord because Ireland itself the Irish themselves saw themselves as a little country, which had, in 1914 had been finally enacted Home Rule for the 1914 Home Rule Act, which was obviously postponed of necessity to the end of the war. But they knew as the war began that, good, we've got it. They were happy with it. The IRB wasn't happy with it because Home Rule or devolution is not the same as independence. But most Irishmen were. Irish people were. And this is what the IRB was against. This is why they thought that 1916, they knew it was a hopeless affair, that they'd all probably be killed or executed. But they went ahead with it because they thought the only way of keeping the flame alive, which they maintained, was that there was a rebellion in every generation, which there wasn't. But they wanted to make sure that their generation had a rebellion because that was the way of keeping, as I say, the flame of independence alive. The trouble with the conscription and the reason for the resistance to it and the movement away from the Irish Parliamentary Party to the more extreme Sinn Féin party, which was the Nationalist Party, although not the IRB's party, was because during the war the agricultural areas of Ireland started to prosper enormously because of the need for food. The standard of living went up, everything was going hunky-dory. But conscription would have taken the able-bodied men away from the farms and the fields and would have hit the income. So, that is part of it. But another part of it is that Irish people were very happy to volunteer, but did not wish to be coerced, which is completely understandable. And so after 1916, the IRB started to reorganize itself, because they saw it as simply the first shot, and they would go for a second. With the success of Sinn Féin, because of hello, bingo. Because of the success of Sinn Féin in the 1918 general election, when they won 72 or 73% of the seats, but mark you, only 48% of the vote, despite enormous personation. It's a point to keep in mind. They never got a majority of the vote. So the Anglicization, keep that in mind, is very strong, it's important. And this is what the IRB in particular was against. Went ahead and started their own parliament, Dáil Éireann, of the members of parliament who had been elected but refused to take their seats at Westminster because they were touting arguing for the independence now of Ireland. There was a lot of sort of somersaults done on this. De Valera came up with a wonderful recipe that once a republic had been established, then the Irish people could decide whether they wanted it or not, which was just nonsense. This is how the IRB saw itself in 1917. No matter what issue it raises, the demand of the people is for freedom. That is why I crossed out the paragraph in your letter where you say that if a majority of the people decided against us, we would submit. I don't, of course, believe that they would so decide, but our convictions are not conditional. They are absolute. These people were not Democrats. And they wanted their republic. They didn't want anything else. And de Valera could go and whistle in the wind. But once they established their republic, they wouldn't let anyone take it away from them. They didn't establish it, but that was what they were going for. I emphasize this is a purist nationalist revolutionary group determined to achieve success using whatever means that came into their power. They had a lot of success, of course. The IRA was completely, the general headquarters staff of the IRA was almost all IRB men, members of the Brotherhood, and consciously so. Nearly every senior IRA officer was in the IRB. They held their meetings, and they had their hierarchy from the Supreme Council down to divisional councils, which are the four divisions of Ireland: Ulster, Munster, Connaught, and Leinster, and then down to the county circles, the county divisions, and then the circles themselves, and the city divisions and the circles within the cities. So they had this whole hierarchy, and it worked fairly well. But after 1916 and the reorganization that took place in 1917 and 1918, saw simultaneously the emergence of Michael Collins as the vital spring in the nationalist campaign. And he cut through the hierarchies. He cut through all this. If he wanted something done, he wouldn't try to go through the systems from one circle to another and so on. He went straight to the person he wanted to, nabbed him and grabbed him and do this, do that. And this was very effective. He got things done quickly. He was a ball of energy. At no one time did he hold fewer than 6 senior officers in the military and political formation of the Irish nationalist grouping. Extraordinary. He needed very little sleep. He used to nap for 2 or 3 minutes at a time. He was famous for getting people out of bed. During the treaty negotiations in London, all the girls, the secretaries, were terrified of him because he would storm into their rooms at 4 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock and just pull them out of bed. And the other thing he did is he would throw their clothes into the bathtub and make them wet. And he said, "There's not enough time for sleeping. Get up, get on with it." He was quite a ball of energy. But of course he was a bully, and that has to be remembered. This is bullying, in fact. But he was very effective, and his control of the IRA was very real. At the end of 1919, Basil Thompson, who was one of Britain's spy masters in Scotland Yard, sent an agent called John Burns to Dublin specifically to find out who was the leading person in the Irish campaign. Who was it? They all knew about de Valera, who was a public figure. He was in America raising money, trying to undercut Michael Collins. But who was it in Ireland who was pulling the strings of the IRA? And this guy, Burns, reported back, it's this man, Michael Collins. And so that is when Lloyd George knew who basically to go to. And he followed that up with sending Andy Cope, one of his a civil servant who was close to him. Andy went on to run the National Liberal Club and was a great liberal. Sent Andy Cope as Undersecretary to Ireland simply to make contact with Collins, which he did. And from March 1920 onwards, Andy Cope and Michael Collins were talking quite regularly. And it is in this transaction that Collins clearly came to understand that a republic was not going to happen. A republic was not something that Britain could allow to happen, particularly in a country that was part of the United Kingdom. Couldn't have that. That was a red line that was inviolable. That message clearly got into Collins, because later on he ran around telling senior IRA men a republic isn't on the cards. We'll have to settle for something less. Now, he was president of the IRB doing this. And so this is powerful stuff. Here you have the Republican organization, the fighters for freedom and independence and getting rid of Britain, saying we can't. We have to accept it. He was being realistic, of course, but it was not something that his people wanted to hear. He tried to balance this by emphasizing the IRB, emphasizing the importance of the IRB. P.S.O. Hegarty, one of his colleagues, recorded a talk that Michael Collins gave. He said he had summoned this meeting for the sole purpose of explaining how the treaty position had arisen, and added that he regarded his first duty as due to the IRB and cared nothing for any other opinion. For him, the IRB was supreme. That was another word he used. The IRB is supreme. And he meant it. And during the treaty negotiations, which brought the shooting to an end in 1921, Collins would refer back not to De Valera and the Doyle cabinet, the ostensible government of nationalist Ireland. No, he went to the Supreme Council and asked their opinion about this, that, and the other, and particularly came to the point about the oath of allegiance that Britain required the Irish members of Parliament, whether or not of the Irish Parliament, that they were willing to, that had actually already been established, to take. And the Supreme Council suggested some changes to it, and Collins secured those changes, and the Supreme Council signed off on it, surprisingly enough. But that was because he dominated the Supreme Council. And here we come to the problem. He was his lack of respect for the hierarchical nature of the organization meant that it's kind of broken up. Its members were there, but they were no longer in the habit of meeting regularly, of receiving orders from the top. There was no way that anything went from the bottom up. This was an organization that did not want debate. It had no mechanism for debate or for disagreement. This was an absolutist affair. You do what you're bloody well told. And the Supreme Council is responsible for telling you through its system. Collins had broken all that and had in effect become the IRB himself. He personified it. He tried to get the IRB to support the treaty, the agreement with Britain, that ended all the fighting, and was accused of using undue elements by opponents of the treaty in doing so. The De Valera put down the fact that the Dáil voted by a small margin to accept the treaty that ended the fighting, put it down to Collins' IRB machinations. But while a majority of the Supreme Council of the IRB supported Collins, A majority of its members did not. And the same thing applied to the IRA. A majority of the GHQ staff, of the leadership in Dublin, supported the treaty. The members lower down did not. And there you have the crack in the system that led to a civil war. We have the wonderful quote from Liam Lynch, if I can just find it. He said, "We have declared for an Irish Republic, and we will live by no other law." This was the officer commanding the IRA's 1st Southern Division, which had conducted most of the fighting that had taken place between 1919 and 1921. And that's his view, and that was the view of a big majority of the IRA. They would not accept the treaty. They wouldn't accept less than a full republic. Collins desperately argued that the treaty was a stepping stone to a full republic, and he was unquestionably right about that, because the treaty led to Ireland having, in effect, dominion status. And everybody knew what that meant. If that had gone through, without a civil war, I think, well, the history of these islands would have been very different, I suspect. But interestingly enough, and this is an aside, Éamon de Valera, who opposed the treaty, later on, when asked what did he think was his biggest mistake, and here we're talking about a political career that lasted something like 70 years. What was his biggest mistake? And he said, not making the treaty work. Which, but that's a retrospective view. But it was the biggest mistake. But on the other hand, and here we go, this is to make an assumption that de Valera spoke for more people than himself. Well, he did. But not for any. He didn't speak for the IRA, and they certainly didn't think that that it was a mistake not to have the treaty work. And in fact, that thinking goes forward to the present day. The IRA, by their own admission, was defeated in 1921, on record as saying that their commander-in-chief said so. Mike Collins, their chief of staff, Richard Mulcahy, said so. They were defeated. They said the best thing we could do was take on a medium-sized police station. And that is the justification. That's what the IRA uses to the present day to justify itself. We started out in 1916 and we still haven't won. We still haven't got our republic. Which it's important to understand that, because otherwise it all looks, it becomes very difficult to comprehend. But it goes very simply, that's what it goes back to. Collins, however, did everything he could to stop a civil war. Shamsha, can I have number 1 and 2 of this? He has a gizmo in his hands which he swore was magical. I think because it probably didn't get to the end of it. There we go. Yeah. Here we go. Thank you. Here, yes. This is colorized. I don't want to mislead you. But Michael Collins, 1922, in August 1922, by arrangement, using IRB contacts, went down to Cork to try and talk to the leading IRA officers and to explain why they could trust him to do everything he could to get a republic, and therefore to stop fighting and trust him and trust the IRB. Now, the IRB's colour, the sunburst colour, yellow. I mean, he was being driven in a Leyland 8 motor car, painted yellow in 1922. How many yellow cars do you see out there today? I mean, I think it's really very significant. And if I press the shift button, the next thing. Oh, yeah, that's it. Thank you. Did you do that? Look at that. That's, I think, inexpertly sewn on. A yellow diamond behind his cap badge. He was going down like a royal progression in a yellow car with a yellow hat, saying, to signify, this is the IRB. I am the IRB. I am not here as an opponent. I'm here in another form. The trouble is he ran into a group of people who didn't know all that. Again, ultimately his fault for not paying attention to the IRB's organization and how it did work. And he was killed in the ambush. That was the hat he was wearing when he was killed. Some years later, the National Army, the Free States Army, put out an order that anything but the green diamond behind the cap badge was to be regarded as irregular. And that meant, they called the IRA the irregulars. That meant that they weren't really part of the system. But I think that this yellow business is Collins in a way recognizing that that the IRB's organization had sort of broken up and was trying to appeal in some form, visual form, to just in case he met some obstinate people. Well, he did meet some obstinate people, but they didn't know about it. And so he was dead. And then, no, it's okay, not yet. Anyhow, with his death, the IRB just broke up. Within 3 months, its leaders had decided that on both sides of the Civil War, because they had split, but they both independently decided there's no point in this anymore and wound it up. It had something of a last gasp in 1924 with what they called the Army Mutiny, when a group of people close to Collins tried to argue that the government wasn't doing what Collins wanted, was happy to revel in the spoils of office rather than continue to fight for an Irish Republic. Maura Comerford, who was in Cumann na Món, which is was the Irish women's nationalist organisation, was in her memoirs reflected on Collins and his squad. Collins' squad was an assassination unit formed of IRB men that went around shooting detectives and people they identified as British agents. She said, she described them, the special squad, Collins's men, based in pubs, not homes, men who were tragically young, the gunmen, the hunters of spies, the hunted, they were the IRB. And that was the world that the IRB inhabited. That was them. That was what Collins had, and that's in the end is what got him killed. Okay, Shamshev, just have the end. Thank you. Magic. We began with Tone, we end with him. Anyway, thank you. I'm delighted to take questions. I'll be surprised if you have any.
John, I can remember from early days looking at the history of the special branch of the Metropolitan Police that they were set up partly, if not mainly, to spy on and find out information about the Irish independence movement. How much success, if any, did the special branch after it was set up in 1870, 1880, and then MI5 have once that was set up in penetrating and getting intelligence about the IRB and the IRA up to 1924?
Well, of course, as you know, it began as the Special Irish Branch, and became the Special Branch within the Metropolitan Police later on, but very closely connected to MI5. They knew who the leaders were. They knew basically the membership, but they didn't know the decisions. That was successfully kept secret by the IRB, most extraordinarily so. There were informers, but the IRB relentlessly tracked anyone that they thought was an informer down and killed them. So it was a pretty, it was a bloody war in the back streets, really. But the special branch, and indeed the government in Ireland, knew basically what the IRB was up to. They just didn't know when. But they knew the leaders. They knew who was who. Yeah. Bob.
I've got a bit of a sore throat, but I think I should fortunately have a microphone. Could I ask you a sort of double-decker question about 1916? Because you said that this had been in large part to disrupt a successful rallying of the Irish people to the war. Is it also true that there were other currents of opinion, particularly perhaps in America, I may have got this from your book, that there had been a decision in principle that in case of a war in Europe, there would be a rebellion, because, as you said, there was to be a rebellion in every generation, and this would be the opportunity. So is that a different kind of way of looking at it? And my sort of second part of the question is, as you said, Pierce notoriously called for blood sacrifice, and yet he surrendered. And Collins was, as you say, a purist member of a purist organisation, and yet he signed a treaty. Does that tell us about the IRB's real motivation? Was it more confusing or more confused than they really themselves thought?
Well, on the first part, Bob, they didn't take a decision that if there was war, the Supreme Council took a decision that there is a war, and now we must have a rising to take advantage. Ireland's opportunity is Britain's weakness. So that's what that happened. And with the full support of Clan na Gael, money and guns in America. As to the second, the problem really was that, as I said, Collins came to personify it. So it wasn't that the IRB possessed these differences. Of course, each individual does. It was that Collins's differences were the operating ones, and he was a realist. De Valera, was not. Collins was a realist. The Free State people were realists. I was asked once where would I put myself today. And I said, my heart is with the Republicans, and my head is with the Free State. They were right. Britain was not going to let Ireland become a republic. No way. In fact, Lloyd George, his threat of immediate and terrible war if they didn't accept the treaty agreement, was very real. He had approximately 21,000 troops all ready to go to Ireland, fully armed, the whole damn lot, on top of the 60, 70,000 already there. This was not an idle threat. And Collins And indeed, anybody who had any sense recognized this. They weren't going to beat this. They couldn't. They were already losing the guerrilla war. Tom Barry, one of the famous IRA fighters, he, although he took the Republican side, he said we were being beaten, and he drew particular attention to two things: the advent of the Royal Air Force flying over the countryside and being able to see groups of men if they were moving. And secondly, to the innovation of having a military sweep where they would flood an area with troops and just herd everyone out and check them, as being something that was the sign of the end. So they weren't going to win. I think Collins was the realist, the realist, capital D, T, capital R, amongst them all. Brendan. Sorry, next.
Thank you very much, John, for the lecture and for the book, which I bought, and I encourage everybody else
So do I.
to do likewise. But and what I find particularly fascinating about your book is its gestation, because you actually met a reasonable number of people who were involved in the events you describe. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because that's pretty unusual, at least for a book about this period. And to what extent you felt that the people you interviewed still believed in the cause they had fought for. But was there any sense, you emphasized quite heavily the human cost, and also the fact that what was striven for was not actually achieved. Did they feel, when you spoke to them in the 60s and 70s, did they feel that it had been worth it?
Thanks, Brendan. Well, there was a range of opinion. Pather O'Donnell was still vehemently that the Republic could have been won. At the start of the Civil War, the Republicans who didn't accept the treaty agreement occupied the forecourts in Dublin, and were then attacked by the Free State forces, the National Army. And Pather said that was the anvil which we should have used to smash the Free State. So there he was, 80 years old, and still quivering with it. I found that when I was interviewed, met over 100 people, more than 50 years ago. I've got a very good doctor. I was impressed by how, when it came to the IRB, regardless of which side they may have taken in the Civil War, they came together in agreement. The IRB was for all of them the true fire, and the Civil War was about whether we could get full independence incrementally and constitutionally versus we want full independence now. So it wasn't about the question of independence; it was about how to get it, and so that freed a lot of people to speak fairly freely. I was lucky in that because of my father. I was well connected, and I met some marvelous ones. One I'd like to draw to people's attention is that it was a marvelous fellow, Joe O'Doherty, whose brother had been president of the IRB, whom I met. He was 90 years old, and he was wonderful. And I said, he told me the following story about how his granduncle, as a young boy, born in 1880, he had sat on his grandfather's knee. Presumably the grandfather at this stage was 90, and been told about his granduncle, his grandfather's brother, who had, in 1798, had been loading hay onto a cart in a field, and bending down to pick up the hay or turf it up, he saw a pair of boots standing behind him and somebody leaning over him and saying, "Are ye out?" "Are ye out" was the catchword for, are you a rebel? Are you coming out in rebellion? And seeing the boots, he realized that this was a yeoman, this was not a rebel who was just trying to mark you down. And so he said, lifting it up, "I'm coming out." But I just thought to myself, here am I, what is this, 230 years later, with one life between me and that tale of 98. And it just goes to emphasize how strong, how important oral culture is. And this is a key element of Irish culture. It's an oral culture. And it carries memories and strength and wonderful mythology, which makes it very, very different. We don't have that. In Ireland, you could be easily talking about some mythical figure in the general conversation. In England, we never do. I think the closest we come to it is King Arthur. Our people are real people. In Ireland, there's a wonderful excitement of imagination, which gives a wonderful, rich culture. And that's what these people were fighting for.
A few moments ago, you described the feeling of must have full independence now. How important was partition in that feeling? And was there a feeling we must have the 6 counties back now, in addition, as part of those feelings? Or, because you haven't heard you mention it yet.
No. The Republicans certainly were fighting for 32-county Ireland. They didn't accept partition at all. I think it's fair to say, however, that in 1921-22, most people in London and in Dublin did not think that partition would be permanent. It hardly appeared in the debates about the treaty, for example. I think there's 10 pages of reportage in the treaty debates about Northern Ireland. Lloyd George, Churchill, Collins didn't think it would last. The great opportunity that was lost, given the fact of partition, was the failure of the two sides to come together under the Imperial Parliament at Westminster, which could have been an easement for both of them to exchange more and more with each other. But that didn't happen, largely because the Republicans just wouldn't accept partition, largely because Unionists in the North wouldn't accept unification, or did not want the existing unity. So it was an impasse, and partition, I think, was inevitable.
That sounds as if there was more willingness to be a bit patient about partition than there was about the independence in the 26 counties.
Yes, I think that, at the same time, the IRA was trying to start more fighting in Northern Ireland. They didn't succeed very well. And of course, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, as it quickly became, was very good about closing things down. But it was thought that economically it wouldn't succeed. And arguably, that's still the case. We subsidise in the transfer agreements every man, woman and child in Northern Ireland to the tune of £2,600, £700 a year. So unification will cost the South a lot of money. On the other hand, it's got a lot of money now, so that may happen. Sorry. Yes, please. I'm sorry, I kept on going.
I was just wondering to what extent you felt that Republican sentiment in Ireland affected other countries associated with British rule, other countries in the Empire. And if so, which?
Well, you certainly had it affected Australia, not so much Canada or New Zealand. But the great one was Israel, or at that stage Palestine, where the Stern gang consciously modelled themselves on the IRA, and one of the I'm not going to bother to look it up, but one of their leaders actually used what's his name, Shamir. He became prime minister later. Used as his code word Michael, in salute to Michael Collins. But no, the real thing is that the French and American revolutions had shown that monarchies and indeed whole governments could be set aside. The independence of Greece and Italy in the 19th century had shown how effective secret societies could be. So it wasn't just Ireland. Ireland was in a tradition that was wider than just Ireland.
Thank you.
At all. Please. What is LJCD?
It's my old high school in California. I'm curious if the IRB ever tried to infiltrate British security forces, and if there were any sympathizers that the IRB had within, say, MI5 or the Royal Irish Constabulary.
Well, they did. The IRB, as an intelligence operation, was particularly effective with its own people. It meant that Michael Collins knew more about his colleagues than they knew about themselves. That was the particular intelligence strength of the IRB. On the other hand, they did have people who came forward. There were a number of women secretaries, for example, who regularly passed on what their bosses were doing and saying and writing. And they had two members of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, Éamon Broy and David Nelligan, who were informers. And Nelligan actually joined MI5 and passed on what he knew. But these were low down. The IRB never penetrated any senior element in the British operation. The British operation was very effective. It's not to be underestimated. It was very effective, and it was winning. It's simple as that. Drinkies?